Just want to make sure that I'm not, like, getting out of hand here.
You're out of line. The whole system is out of line. Or you're out of order. Is that what it is?
I guess.
Right? You're out of order. You're out of order. This court's out of order.
That's right, because out of line would be like, you can't go to Disneyland now.
Well, hold on. Do you say online or inline?
Stand in line.
Inline?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You don't queue?
No, I'm not English.
Okay. No, because I used to say online, and I'm not sure if that's like a Greek thing because I don't speak English the way that English speakers speak English.
ESL?
It is, seriously. Seriously. I learned English when I was really little, thanks to Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers primarily.
And now, if you were growing up, it would be Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Because we've anthropomorphized a tiger and put a cardigan on him. Is that what it is?
I think it's anthropomorphicated.
So we got one interesting bit of follow-up from some people who listened. Apparently a confusing bit for people out there who might be listening is that we apparently sound too much alike.
Right. I don't really know what the right solution to that problem is. I guess, like, I could speak in an English accent for the rest of the time we talk.
Can you actually pull it off?
I could give it a shot, couldn't I, Governor?
That's not bad. I don't know. If I refer to you as Christian, then hopefully people can extrapolate that it is Steve currently talking and vice versa. I don't know.
Or maybe
Hopefully.
we could just, like, do, like, The Rock's wrestling days and just start with everything saying, like, Christian says, da-da-da-da-da-da, and always talk in third person. Can you smell what Christian is cooking?
Oh, that's what I was going to do. I do, actually. I do. It's really a shame that the raised eyebrow doesn't come across in the podcast format.
There's got to be, like, a Tim Allen raised eyebrow sound effect.
I went way more high-pitched.
I missed that show.
Yeah, it was good. It was good. The mystery of the neighbor, Wilson, who then possibly became a volleyball and then hung out with Tom Hanks for a while.
Oh, my gosh.
I sometimes try to see if I can force different movies and things into, like, the same universe just to see what would happen. And I guess that's what would happen. Like, Wilson got into a plane crash and he saved himself by becoming a volleyball that could float in the water, and then he made his way to Tom Hanks, and then he escaped again in time for the Tool Time reunion. Yeah, it worked. All's well that ends well.
So, yeah, those for you listening, sorry that we sound the same. You're just going to, I guess, have to figure that out.
Stick with it.
Hang in there, guys. We'll take you on a ride somewhere. It might not be exactly the destination that you bought a ticket for, but it'll be somewhere.
What a great tagline. Pop culture coffee hour. There's a destination. Trust us.
We think.
So, I don't know. We will do our best. We'll try to refer to each other's names or something so that people can figure out who exactly is talking. But in the meantime, dear listener, in the meantime, dear Christian, I apologize.
Stephen, your apology is accepted.
Thank you, Christian, for accepting my, Stephen's, apology.
Stephen, you're welcome.
That was the first point of follow-up that we have now addressed, Christian, And I think the second one is a revisitation of some of the conversation that we were having last week. And this is a point that my sister-in-law brought up after a conversation that I had with her after we recorded the last podcast. And she came up with, like, a really nice phrase, which I thought was good, which kind of helped some of this fundamentalism talk that we were sort of skirting around a little bit, some of what was going on in Kevin Allen's podcast. And she came up with the phrase cultural idolatry, which I thought was really kind of like hit at what we were talking about, because the point is we don't want to idealize the past, right, and sort of fear the present moment and rely on some sort of past and give it some sort of, like, golden age moral weight. But we also don't want to overly privilege the present and sort of judge the faith according to the standards of the present. You don't want to turn culture, whether it is past or present or future culture, into an idol. Like, Christ needs to be at the center. It's just a question of communicating and translating the gospel message to the people and the time in which you find yourself.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. I think you're right that there is the idolatrous tendency that we have just as, living and breathing human beings. But I wonder, maybe we can almost think of it not in the same sense that we think of, like, iconography as iconography, but almost like a cultural kind of iconography, to look through the lens of culture to see the undying truths instead of to treat culture itself like it is itself a golden calf.
Yeah. Because it's like everything, I think, like St. Athanasius says this, like all sin eventually boils down to idolatry on some level because your worship is not towards God, your worship is towards something else. And, when it comes to the way that we interact with culture, that can definitely happen. So I guess that's just something to be aware of. And I think it's a nice phrase. Maybe we should just sort of like keep rolling with this. The art question, right? You mentioned icons and you mentioned idolatry, and I feel like that gets us to kind of like art, because we talked a little bit last time about art, and we talked about how art can actually be one of the best ways to communicate like important themes. We brought up Brothers Karamazov as possibly like the best articulation of the faith, or at least one of the best articulations of the faith, even though it's a novel, it's not like a work of literature. It's a question actually that came up on the Orthodox Christian subreddit, which I frequent every now and again, and somebody was asking about icons specifically and art. Can you put an icon in like an art exhibit, and is it still an icon in that sort of sense? So I think that's a cool thing to think about, because on the one hand, as Orthodox Christians, at least in our liturgical worship space, we're surrounded by what we frequently call sacred art. But is it really? Like, is it art?
Sure. All right, next question. Yeah.
Everybody go home.
Why wouldn't it be art? I mean, I guess that brings up the question of like, what is art? What constitutes a work of art, and what is art even for? Like, why art?
That's true. How would you answer those questions?
Well, I asked them. Maybe it's like a Greek ESL thing, but the way the questions work is that one person poses them and another responds.
Wait, hold on. I have to write that down.
Yeah, so
in America, ...
When you start thinking about questions of what is art and what is the purpose of art, I feel like you have to almost approach it from opposite sides of the same question, in the sense that art is not only something that is formed, but something that does forming. Mm-hmm. Like that it is something that not only that the artist works upon, but that the art piece then works upon the audience. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so I almost wonder, like, in its most distilled and basic sense, if art is for forming people to a certain vision of a kingdom or a certain way of kind of inhabiting the world, then I would say absolutely icons are art. And I would say they're probably the most effective art and the most important art, because they give us these really clear and distinct images of the good life that, according to Orthodox Christian standards, right? Like the closed mouth is one who listens to God. That is itself, I think, an artistic rendering of the good life. It's not to say that the saints never said anything ever, right? Like that's not what we're revealing in the icons, or what icons reveal to us, but that they reveal a deeper reality, that these men and women were always listening, right? Even when they were speaking.
Mm-hmm. So you're sort of saying that like art is about a message and kind of forming a person to that message, and that icons are a really good example of this.
I don't even know if I would say that it's a message, because that sounds way too like didactic. Okay, so now I think we're getting into like even deeper questions of what does it mean to be human, and what kind of creatures are we? Are we primarily creatures who think and need messages given to us, or are we primarily creatures who live in the world more through intuition and feeling and imagination and desire than anything else? Because then I think the question is, then what's the point of art? Because there's some really bad art that's really preachy. You don't want to watch those movies. You don't want to read those books. You're getting beaten over the head with something. But like the best art is the one that kind of goes behind your thoughts and kind of gets you from your heart, right? Like it can creep past your thoughts and get you in a place where you're like feeling your way into the art rather than thinking your way into the art.
It seems to me like what you're saying, and I think I'm agreeing with you, that art is not simply like an emotional thing. It's not simply an intellectual thing. There's something a little bit more holistic to it, at least good art, and that icons take that in an even deeper sort of way, because icons are that sort of holistic encounter. But there's a personal encounter too, because there really is somebody on the other side. Through the icon, you're relating to the prototype, like St. Basil would say, and then St. John of Damascus after him. And even through the person depicted, like if it's a saint, I mean, even in that person, you're kind of going back to the prototype of that person's humanity, which is Christ. So you're kind of like going through levels of icons, in a sense, to finally get back to Christ, who in his own right is an icon of the Father. So there's level upon level of encounter and personal encounter. So it's not simply like holistic relation to an idea or to a theme, but there really is a person on the other side.
Right. And not to distill it into this kind of terminology, but in all of those, persons are characters, right? Like they're characters in this big story, in this true story, this real story that God is doing, right? Like there's this story that from the beginning has been going on of God's action within creation, in human beings, and it's like most primarily seen in the incarnation, right? So that when we look at icons, we're not only looking at depictions of these persons or having encounters with these persons, we're also telling a story that's been told for forever, and hearing a story that's been told forever, right? That God desires to dwell in human flesh, and that he did so and does so, which is why he can be depicted in material goods. And not to even mention the story that we tell of the spirit-bearing capacity of creation in this way, right? That the spirit comes to us through these pieces of wood and paint. Like, it's just amazing that that's something that we believe can happen. To say that it's art in the same sense that, like, Vincent van Gogh's work is art, I wouldn't say is true. Like, can Vincent van Gogh's work be formative? Sure. But is it formative in the same way? No, but is it similar? Yes.
Yes and no.
Yeah, so I guess maybe that's where it ends for me. It's like, are icons art? Yeah, they are. And are they just art? No, they're not.
Have you ever seen an icon hanging in a museum?
Yeah.
We have a couple of those here at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and I think there are icon museums in other places. Icons exist from the past in art museums, and it's very interesting walking through the halls, and you sort of go through an exhibit and you're amongst the Impressionist stuff, and then you turn a corner and then you're kind of in medieval Europe or Byzantine Europe or whatever it is, and you see an icon on the wall, and I mean, it's very clearly an icon on the one hand, because it's got the forms and it's got the colors and it's got every sort of familiar thing that makes it seem like an icon. But there's a distance there because it's behind, depending on how old it is, it might be behind layers of bulletproof glass, and it might be in kind of an atmospheric controlled chamber. And it's in that distance, it loses its iconic nature, or it loses its iconic feel, however you want to phrase this. For me, that's where kind of what you said, that in some ways, like maybe icons are a kind of art, or maybe there's something artistic about them, but on the other hand, there's something incredibly unique going on, because they're not just conveying something, they're manifesting something. And they're not manifesting something limited, like an idea from the past. Like, they're really showing you who a person is, like here and now, in a sense, in eternity, in the kingdom. When it's in the museum, it's in the fact that it is reduced more and more to a story. Maybe that's a way to think about it too, because like you look at the icon on the wall and you can get a message out of it, and you see a feast day, or you see some sort of characteristics about a figure that is depicted in it, and it becomes less about this personal story of interaction, because the story of salvation is really this interaction between God and man, and it becomes less that, and it becomes a morality tale, or it becomes kind of like a sliver. It's a branch broken off of a tree. It's a lion in a zoo, like behind bars. It's a really cool way to look at it. I think a thing about that, though, is that we're so guilty, I feel like, as Orthodox Christians, of doing that to our icons, of reducing them to art in a very thin sense of the word.
Like, if you really think about it, kind of like such a sad modern iteration of iconoclasm.
Yeah,
Like, it's just iconoclastic. When I see icons on T-shirts or on bulletins, I'm just like, these are no longer icons. These are now our logos. And when it's a logo, it loses its power. We become desensitized to the reality of the icon, I think.
It becomes background noise, and even worse, it becomes a commodity that you eventually toss.
Right. And that you put in a museum later. Because look at this thing that these silly people did once.
Maybe. Yeah, like people will dig through the landfills and find an old church bulletin.
Right.
Church bulletins for me are such a huge pet peeve, because
I know, what do? Do I kiss it?
Do I burn it when I'm done with it because it has an icon and I don't want the icon to have a dirty diaper on top of it?
Yeah.
You know,
Which in
when
my
I throw it
house
in the
is a
trash?
possibility, by the way.
Yeah, right? That's the
A
thing.
very real one.
Yeah, I mean, several on a daily basis.
Right.
And what do you do? Like, we're so interested in that sort of like formal sense. And maybe that's even an example of like cultural idolatry. You know, this has to look Orthodox, right? Like, it's the bulletin of an Orthodox parish, so clearly it has to have an icon on the front.
Right, which you think would mean then that there's like a clear celebration of like the culture, but it really just does end up being a devaluation and a degradation of it in the end. You know, like when it's put in its proper place, then we can honor it well. When we put Christ where he belongs and like make him the object and the subject of our worship, then we don't have time to worship others like cultures, you know?
Yeah, that's true. And we can interact with culture in a more appropriate way. Hopefully, because like we're still seeing Christ at the center of that culture, and hopefully we're shaping our culture to express him and introduce people to him, because the icon on the church bulletin is not doing that. You know, if anything, it's cheapening it, like you said, and sort of teaching people the wrong message about what this is. It's a logo as opposed to like a personal thing. It's a decoration as opposed to like a liturgical object.
Right, which ends up telling a completely different story then about what Orthodox Christianity is. Right, in that to kind of keep the language of story going, because I feel like maybe that's the linking point between art and anything else is what's the story that it tells? What's the story to this thing? And is that a story that awakens my imagination and my desire for God? Or is it a story that awakens my imagination and my desire for something else? Looking at an icon on the wall in the church awakens my desire for God and God's kingdom. But maybe in a museum, it awakens a desire for, you know, some sort of rich cultural heritage, some sort of idolatry of the past in a very disguised way, you know, in a way that doesn't seem like a lesser kingdom than God's kingdom, but it kind of is.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's the linking point is like, what's the story that's being told and what is it awakening in me? What do I believe to be the best good that I could want right now? Is it the past or is it the Lord? And if it's the Lord, then I think we're getting into like some really good and true art. And if it's not the Lord, then maybe it's not so great. And maybe it's something that we need to reevaluate or critique, you know, in some way. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. And I'm trying to process in my head, and I don't really have a precise answer to this, or maybe even like a way of framing this as a question, but there's got to be a relationship between us doing icons properly, like us having like a non-iconoclastic sense of these images, which are, like we said before, kind of art, but also kind of not. There's got to be a relationship between doing those well and then the sort of formation that they do and the way that those formed people then create art. It seems to me like if as a people, because one of the things that we talked about last time too was like, wouldn't it be cool if there were more Orthodox movies and music and things like that? But I feel like if we can't get icons down and if we can't get the sort of like fundamentals of like our story straight and our position and place in this gradual unfolding of salvation history, like if we can't get that right, then how can we ever expect to reflect it in a softer sense in movies and music and art generally?
I don't even know if I would say return it into like a softer sense even, because art is so covert in some ways. You know what I mean? Like it's really sneaky.
Yeah.
Like that's the things that I really love about art. It's how sneaky you can be with it. And yet still just as hard hitting. There's this great quotation from C.S. Lewis that I actually just kind of stumbled on a couple days ago. Again, like it was one that I found before, but I love it. So he's kind of talking about like how we tend to just kind of overthink faith and how we kind of turn it into like a mental exercise. Like the truths of it kind of get lost on us, you know, because we're too busy like thinking about the theological
Because we over-intellectualize them?
Yeah, that we don't actually ever let them come close to our heart. So he says this, suppose that by casting all these things, he's talking about the Christian faith, suppose by casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons? And by the watchful dragons, he's talking about like our thoughts. Could we maybe steal past those and get into like the real kind of stuff that Jesus wants to do in our hearts, which I think is really like the key to all of it in the strictest sense. It's not ultimately about being orthodox, right? It's about having Christ work in our hearts to change us, to form us into his artwork, right? As St. Paul says, that we are his masterpiece. We are his workmanship, his poema, right? Like, we are his piece of art. We are his own creation that he began in Genesis, and he is continuing to form. We're clay in the hands of the potter, right? So, like, maybe that's ultimately what art is meant to do to us, is to help make us into art pieces of the Lord. We're too busy thinking and trying to make ourselves into our own image as opposed to his.
I guess the other side of that, too, I think that's really beautifully said. Art sometimes can be a very spontaneous thing. Not to say that it's an irrational thing, but it can be an irrational or sort of transrational thing, too. When we live too much in our heads, that can limit us, and that can like limit our outputs, like limit what we actually are capable of creating, and limit the way that we actually are able to sort of like think about the world and experience the world. I fall into this a lot. I tend to live in my head, and I tend to sort of over-intellectualize things, and I have very sort of crypto-dualistic sympathies, for lack of a better word. Like, I'd totally be okay being a brain in a vat somewhere and not having a body.
Like in Futurama, all the heads are just in those jars.
Not even a face. I could just be a brain just connected to some like diodes and wires in a vat. Because like, I don't know, like I would totally be cool being just like a noetic being and not at all a physical incarnational being.
Kind of like that Johnny Depp movie now. Sort of.
Oh, Johnny Mnemonic?
No, Johnny Depp lives in a computer.
Yeah, isn't that Johnny Mnemonic?
No, that was a Keanu Reeves movie.
Oh, Keanu Reeves. Oh, yeah.
What was that one called?
Oh.
You know the one I'm talking about? Johnny Depp, the one that came out a couple years ago.
I think I might have seen it actually too. Yeah, he gets uploaded somehow and then, I don't know, something? Title?
Anyway.
Clearly.
Definitely wasn't Edward Scissorhands. That's all that we can say, is it's not Edward Scissorhands.
It's so dumb, but that is one of the temptations in my heart. I am profoundly uncomfortable with the limitations of the physical world. And if I could be like a cyborg, I'd at least have to talk myself out of it.
Right.
But that's the thing. Like, I have over-intellectualized thought, and for a long time in my life, I was just totally incapable of appreciating dance, for instance, which is obviously a very physical thing. Not to say that there's no thought or intellect that goes into it, but it's not as obvious, I guess, to me in a dance performance as it is in like a book, which is very clearly like a communication of words and thoughts and grammar and all that sort of stuff.
It's a different kind of intellect, dance and visual art and even performing art.
Yeah. One that for me like has taken more effort on my part to actually cultivate. But that's the thing. You can totally live in your head and cut yourself off from the beauty that a dance performance can give you. And just something that it says about the sort of the beautiful lines and grace and strength and coordination of the human body, which God has given us. And it's just this magnificent sort of praise and celebration of our physicalness. And also ideas. I mean, because you can have a dance about a theme or an idea or an event or whatever it might be.
Right. But to say that I think that the dance is about themes and ideas, or to even like convey a theme or an idea, would maybe be to miss the art form for what it is, because it isn't simply to convey that, right? They may have them and they may be bred out of them, but there is something ultimately that the dance is trying to win you over toward. And it's not even trying to win you over in an intellectual way, because it can't do that. By its very form, it will not do that. It's trying to win you over towards something by, I don't know, getting you going in a different way, by helping you feel your way into that idea rather than think your way into it.
Yeah. Which I guess is something that ultimately all art is doing in some sort of way.
Right.
And we can totally close ourselves off from it. At least good art, yeah. Because we can also have a conversation about what's the dividing line between art and propaganda. Right?
Yeah,
I feel like that's another sort of like classic divide that you can have. And I feel like there's all sorts of levels of honesty and sort of directness and openness and transparency, whatever. That's kind of a tangent, and that could take us into a totally different conversation. But
so then maybe like it comes down to art being born again out of a story. that it participates in a story and tells a story. And this is the thing, right? Good art is like, it comes from someone who actually believes what they're saying. If you don't really believe in what you're putting out there, then I don't think it's really art. It's dishonest.
Yeah.
You know, it's a product. It's, I don't know, it's not filled with those timeless things, right? Of truth, beauty, and goodness. But to lay forth a vision of truth, beauty, and goodness, I think like you can't help but come up with art if you're just being honest and telling a story. You know?
Yeah, even if it's not necessarily your story, it's at the very least somebody else's story as you, as the artist, understand it and convey it.
Right.
You know, there still is a level of sort of interpersonalness and like subjectivity, you know, kind of an interaction of persons and your intersection with somebody else's story. And, you know, maybe the way that that story sort of fits in with the meta story that you were talking about before, like the story of Christ and the incarnation and the story of salvation history.
Right, which is all really what we're all trying to figure out is that meta story, right?
Yeah, no, totally. And that's kind of like what art, on some level, I suppose, like maybe this is a controversial sort of statement, but I feel like it's the sort of thing, again, C.S. Lewis would say that we're all sort of grasping after Christ, even if we can't find him. And, you know, hopefully we'll be pleasantly surprised when the curtain is finally drawn and we step into the next line. It's like, oh, you were the one I was looking for this entire time. And, you know, when I wrote this piece of music and I was trying to express something, it was really me just sort of like grasping for Christ. Or when I put together this movie that was talking about like loss and family or whatever it was really just me trying to come to terms with this pain and like reach out to Christ. And I feel like all of these things on some level, which is why you can interact with these sorts of things if you're ready for them, and you can pull something out of them if you're able to do that as well. I feel like that's something innate in our nature, in our characters, to sort of grasp after and to try to connect ourselves back to that current of salvation history and Christ.
Yeah, I think that's got to be it. You know, like that's ultimately why we make art at all, because we're grasping for something, for goodness himself, for beauty himself, for truth himself. And that this is like the most feeble expression of our desire for that, right? Or like our attempt at grasping him. I
will say this, which this also might be a little bit controversial.
I'll go with you there. I like controversy.
Controversy's good, unless it's not.
Not a big fan of contraband. But
contraband, oh no.
Yeah.
No, got to report that.
Yeah.
Declare it, I should say.
There was that old video game just called Contra, which you may or may not remember.
Down, up, left, A right, BA start, right? Or something like that, the old Contra code.
Up, down, left,
up,
right,
down,
left, right, BA, select, start.
Oh, there you go. See, I never got the extra lives.
Maybe.
Womp, womp.
Up, down, left, right, BA, start.
Yeah, it's like the classic Contra code.
Yeah.
People who have never played Nintendo before are like, what are they talking about right now? I was going to say something controversial. Okay, so here's the controversial thing.
Sorry.
No, it's good. I like that because it was a wave of nostalgia. I'm in a very good place right now after thinking about Contra and Duck Hunt and all that stuff.
And Turtles in Time. Do you remember that game?
Oh my goodness, heck yeah, I do.
Okay, anyway, controversy.
So the controversial point, which is something that I have thought about for the last few years, is that it seems to me that I personally am more drawn to, if you want to call this like secular art, and I don't like the word secular, but sort of like non-church art, right? Non-iconography, non-hymnography, that sort of stuff. I'm more drawn to tragic art than to comic art or happy art, if that makes any sense. And the thesis that I put forward for you now is that I feel like this sort of stuff, it's easier for songs to be sad and be sort of like authentically sad because we all have access to the pain and the sorrow and the tragedy. But I feel like the happiest songs that I've ever encountered, the most authentically, like in a non-sappy, a really sort of well-rounded and fleshed out and like authentic and deep and three-dimensional joy, are like nothing tops Christ is Risen. I feel like the grumpy sort of like tragic songs, because I listen to sort of metal, sort of angry music a lot of times too, and like that sort of stuff gets it. It gets at the pain of human existence. But my thesis is that the stuff that really gets to the joy of human existence tends to be, not exclusively, but we can think about exceptions, but tends to be stuff that is more overtly grounded in the church.
I think that that's the only way that you could really find authentic joy, right? Because like authentic joy is knowing that even in the midst of death type situations, right? That God is and will act for the sake of life. And that Christ has risen, trampling down death by death, is a confession of that, right? It's always that tension between life and death. He doesn't trample down death by rising from the dead. He tramples down death by dying. But there is still that joyful expression of he's risen from the dead, having trampled down death by death. It's this weird tension. So, I mean, I would agree that the joy expression is found in the church, but there also seems to me to be like this need for the dark in order for the light to shine out of it. I mean, I wouldn't say like eternally that that's the case, but I would say at least for our own human experience, that is the case. That we cannot know the light until we have found ourselves in the dark.
Yeah, not in an existential sense, but like maybe in a didactic sense. Because essentially we're all just grown-up little kids, and sometimes we're not going to know like responsible behavior until we've burned our hands on the stove.
Sure, yeah.
So why don't we hit our top 5 for this week?
Yes.
Why don't we hit our top 5 works of art that have like formed us or shaped us, hit at the core of who we are and helped make us, I guess, who we are today.
Yes. Why don't you get us started,
Right?
Steve?
Okay, I'm starting. Oh, and I would say, by the way, one of the rules to this top 5 is we're not putting down the Brothers Karamazov because I feel like that's an easy answer and it came up already before. So that could be on this list, but it's not on this list. So number 1, I'm going with the Chronicles of Narnia.
Yes. Yes.
And specifically, woo! Shout out to all the C.S. Lewis nerds out there.
Yeah.
Woo! Representing. I mean, there's a lot of amazing things that we can pull out of the Chronicles of Narnia.
Yeah. Oh
But
my
for
gosh.
me-
Everywhere.
Right? So many things. All the things you can pull out.
Yes.
So many things. For me, I guess the most powerful thing that still resonates and is always the first theme or the first scene that I go back to when I revisit these books is in the last one, in the last battle, the dwarves. And so, the last battle has been won, and Aslan is inviting everybody into like an amazing, improved Narnia, right? And it's really Christ inviting everybody into the kingdom. And suddenly the flowers smell better, and the grass is greener, and everything is more amazing. Everything has sort of been lifted up Eucharistically, and the world has reached its destiny, and the world is the kingdom. And these dwarves are brought into it, but the dwarves were on nobody's side. They were always sort of sticking out for themselves, and they're sitting in the midst of all of this beauty, and they're just like talking to themselves and thinking to themselves, and they're reflecting on how terrible it is and how they're in this dark stable. And Aslan lays out this amazing meal, which is a sign of the banquet, and all they taste is straw and hay. And like they're in the middle of this amazingness, and they can't experience any of it. And it is one of the most profound things that I've come across in literature, and one of the most terrifying things that I've come across in literature too, because like they're in hell, and it's a hell of their own devising. Aslan is sitting there inviting them to the table,
But they're not
and
open
it's just,
to the things that Aslan has for them.
yeah, and it's powerful, and it hits me because I just think that how many times during the course of the day am I a dwarf? How many times do I respond to love with anger? How many times do I respond to kindness with grumpiness? Like, how many times do I reject the beauty that is given to me from the people in my life, from God, from all sorts of different angles? How many times do I reject it? When I trap myself in my own anxiety and my own grumpiness, I'm in a stable. But I'm in a stable because I've put myself in the stable. Like, that hits me every time. And like, I'm getting goosebumps even thinking about it now.
It's freaking me out a little bit.
Sorry, didn't mean to do that.
No, but I mean like in the good way of like, oh, Lord, have mercy. Open my heart. Open my heart, Lord.
That was number 1.
I love
I
it.
just love it. Number 2.
For me, number 2, there's a film that I don't know that I can recommend, but I know that has deeply shaped my life. Magnolia by P.T. Anderson. And have you ever seen it?
Yeah, Tom Cruise, right?
Oh, yeah. Fantastic movie. I mean, I think just one of the best ever made. Really dark. We'll probably talk about this at some point in the future, but like some of the content itself is really hard to deal with. But there's this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer when he says, "We must view people less in light of what they do or don't do, and we must view them in the light of what they suffer." And Magnolia really elucidated that truth for me. That it's just full of these people who have come from immense suffering and are just so sad and so hurt, and that there's so much that they do that is really just an attempt to alleviate their suffering. And it filled me with great compassion for the characters. And I think it was really the first time watching a movie that I understood why people do really terrible things and why people can be just really awful people. And my response was not like judgment, it was compassion. And so I feel like walking away from that, I at least have always that in the back of my mind, that when someone's doing something awful, it's because they're suffering in some way, that there's something going on. It's not about what they're doing or not doing. It's about how they're suffering. And I think that's hopefully made me a more compassionate person in general. I don't know specific moments it always does, but I at least like to think that it has. So Magnolia, which I have a lot of love for, but on an H Faith Radio podcast probably can't recommend.
Or consult your parents.
Yeah, message me privately on Facebook. Maybe I'll recommend it then.
Yeah, I almost recommended a P.T. Anderson movie too. There Will Be Blood. I think that's P.T. Anderson too.
Yeah, that is. That's also a great movie.
So that was almost my number 3 because I'm a fan of Anderson, but I decided to go old school again and maybe go classic again. And I picked The Lord of the Rings for number 3.
Yeah, dude.
Which, again, shout out to all the nerds out there, right? I mean, I read The Lord of the Rings once a year, every year, for probably like 5 or 6 summers at least.
Do you speak Elvish?
I thought about it, but I had to draw the line somewhere.
Thank God.
Never went that far.
Because I was seriously about to like make fun of you big time if you did.
We're just going to cancel the rest of this podcast. We're done.
Yeah.
We're done. Never again. Not talking to you.
Yeah, we're done here. Friendship terminated.
Delete.
Or however you say that in Elvish, which you would know.
I can neither confirm nor deny.
So go on, Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
You read it every year.
Amazingness, there's plenty of amazingness that's out there, but I'm going to focus on one specific scene, kind of like Narnia. And the scene that I always love is, I think it's when we encounter the Ents for the first time. And the Ents talk about how the elves, way back in the day, taught the Ents and the trees how to speak, taught them language. That has always been one of my favorite just like ideas that's not really developed all that much, but it's there lurking behind the surface, you know, obviously with the characters and so forth. But I love that idea because that is such an aspirational idea in terms of the way that I hope I deal with the world. Because for me, that's so Eucharistic. Like the elves had this beautiful blessing. They had the gift of the word. They had the gift of logos, right? And so what do? They go in love to the rest of the creation and they give them this gift that they have received. And they give it and they raise creation up to this higher level of consciousness. And suddenly, like, the trees are not simply trees, and the Ents are not simply Ents, but they were mute before, and now they can speak, and the Ents are notoriously long-winded, and they just go on for hours and hours.
Right. They never say anything unless it's worth taking a long time to say.
Quite right.
That's periodic. Don't be hasty.
And that's just beautiful for me, because this, I feel like, is now, especially having a dog, actually, like, I am more aware of this because, like I said before, I have this very sort of dualistic streak within me. And I didn't like animals for a long time either, insofar as I don't like my own animalness, right? I like my insouledness more than I like my animalness. Like, I just don't like physical things a lot of the time. But it's cool having a dog and seeing that my dog has a personality and seeing that, like, in my dog's interactions with human beings, he is lifted up to something sort of like more than he was. You know, because like he takes verbal cues from human beings, and we took kind of wild wolves and we turned them into these personable creatures with personality and who are capable in some sort of way of like love and interaction. And it's amazing that in the same way that God breathes life into us, we, in a sense, you know, breathe life into the world. And I guess that's just us being priests of creation. But there's something incredibly beautiful to the elves teaching the world how to speak and infusing it with the word. And I don't know, I try to not dislike physical things as much as I used to.
That's good, because God likes physical things. I don't know if you know, but he's into like stuff.
He does.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Lord of the Rings. Those are great books. Number 4, the television show Lost was probably one of the most important things that I ever did with my life. So this is like a 5-year-old, spoiler alert. So if you're watching it, stop listening right now. But in the end, you learn that they're all dead. That there's these two kind of universes that they're in. One where everything that happens on the island actually happens, And there's no controversy about that in my mind. Everything on the island, real. But then in the last season in particular, there's like this kind of second sideline timeline where things are happening in the realm where they all dwell spiritually. They've all died. It's many, many years after the story that has happened on the island has happened, where all of them are now finally dead. And it's like this series of them finding one another and remembering the life that they've had and remembering who they were and where they've come from and where they now are and who they are. And it's just like this beautiful story of like personal formation and spiritual formation and repentance. You know, there was a lot of controversy with Lost. A lot of people were so upset with the ending of it. I was like very emotionally satisfied. I was like, yes, they're all together. Because for me, the show was always about the people. It was never about the weird smoke on the island and the polar bears and all the other weird, wacky stuff that kind of happened that people wanted answers for. They were like, we need answers. We want answers. And I'm like, if you want answers for these things, then you're like not living in the same world as I am, because a lot of things that happen in our lives just don't have answers. But what matters is who we are and who we become through those things that happen. And that we love one another and that we're going to be together in eternity. And we need to kind of embrace that part of it and treat each other with that eternal mind instead of getting so wrapped up in all the weird stuff that happens. And so Lost really like opened that truth to me, you know? And so like, I don't know, it filled me with a desire for the kingdom in a way that very few other like television shows ever have. Maybe also Heroes, which almost made my list as well, this season 1 of Heroes. But Lost was really a really important show for me in that way, in terms of kind of coming to grips with like understanding being reunited in the kingdom and having at least an understanding of where we've come from, yet not being defined by that any longer, having the story completed in some way.
Interesting.
And so I want that.
Okay, now I definitely have to watch Lost at some point.
So good.
I resisted because people were very unhappy with the ending, but okay, I've got to put that on the queue at some point.
It's great, because then in season 6 especially, you get kind of like a prophet character who can see into the future where they're all together. Like he can see that world where they're all dead. Yeah. And I think they kind of missed the mark, because he comes back and he's like, it's all good, man. Everything's going to be okay. But he like misses out on like the crisis that they're in. It's like, it's still actually a crisis, but he can not approach it like, don't worry about it. But you can approach the crisis confidently rather than kind of nirvanic filled. He's almost like nirvanic about it. Is that a word, nirvanic?
It is now.
Okay, we did it.
That's right. 200 years from now, when the Oxford English Dictionary is amended, they will say episode 2 of Pop Culture Coffee Hour.
Nirvanic.
Well done.
So number 5, sorry.
Number five. I'm going to go something totally different. I'm going to go Futurama for my number 5. Did you ever watch Futurama?
You know, it's one of those shows that I love watching whenever I watch it and feel like I never get enough of it, but then always kind of put it on the back burner when it comes time for things to watch.
Oh, it's so good.
I know, I love it. I do love what I've seen.
Yeah. So this one is, I think, the most emotional, and it's just a classic episode. It's called Jurassic Bark. The characters are in the museum, and they see this old fossilized dog, and it turns out to be Fry's dog from way back in the day. So, like, he remembers his interactions with his dog. And, like, the culmination of the story at the very end is Fry ends up getting frozen, and that's how he ends up in the future. He's frozen for 1,000 years, and he comes out in the year 3000. And the dog doesn't know this. So the dog is obedient to his command and waits for him outside of the pizzeria where he worked. So you see at the very end of the episode, the dog just sits by the fire hydrant, and the seasons pass and the years go by, and it just sits there and it waits for Fry to come back. And it never forgot him, and it never stopped loving him. And for me, it always gets dusty in the room when I watch that episode. Number 1.
Funny.
Always. Yeah.
And the dust always gets right in your eyes.
Right. Yeah. Seriously. Just, for those moments.
I'm not crying. It's just raining on my face.
Out of my face, actually.
I was just cutting some onions.
I have allergies, even though I'm not allergic to anything. It's really powerful. And I think for me, it's just such a beautiful reminder that life without the other really is not life in the fullest. And this poor dog, the center of his life is Fry. He's the dog, and Fry is the master, the human in the relationship. And like his whole life revolves around Philip J. Fry. And when he loses him, he waits for him, and like he remains loyal and he remains loving. When you come back home and your dog has just missed you for a few hours, and it's like the best thing in the world, like nobody is ever as happy to see you as your dog is happy to see you. It's a beautiful study in personhood and this relational aspect to who we are, and that it is tragic when one of us dies, and it really is tragic when one of us goes away, and how there really is a void that is left. And the dog just sat there for years and years and waited until he just passed away as well. Like always true to his best friend. For me, it's just beautiful because like that's what life is, right? Like life is personal, life is relational, life is about us together. And it sucks when we're no longer together.
Well, and I feel like even if we want to talk about, too, like the meta-narrative, like that tells a bigger story with Christ, right? If we're the dog and Christ is the master, he's coming back, though.
Yeah.
You know, like we can be confident in that, even if we don't see it in our lifetime. He comes back.
We're waiting by the fire hydrant for him.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful, man. I want to go find that episode and watch it now.
Jurassic Bark. Don't cut onions while you watch it.
Maybe eat onion rings.
Crunch.